Welcome to Norse Code, the number one podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I'm your host with the most here, Dusty O'Connell. Joining me from across the tin can and string, useful human, Arif Hassan. How are you, Arif?
I am. How are you?
I am as well. Arif, of course, is a columnist for coldomaha.com, 1500ESPN.com, Daily Norseman, and other places around the internet. I don't know, the mood in our little slice of North Korea has been morose this week. I think we're all kind of like shocked and stunned. And I don't know. I don't think we should feel that way. Like this is an uncharacteristic like moment of not like self-aware cynicism for Vikings Twitter, I think. But we'll talk about that in just a minute. I wanted to say thank you to everybody who has contributed to the show in the past. All of our Patreon sponsors keep the lights on for a mere $3.50 a month. You can help us keep the Loch Ness Monster at bay, as well as, hooking up the show with better tools to deliver the kind of analysis that you can only hear on Norse Code week after week, twice a week during the season, customarily. And of course, the best guests and the highest quality hosting that your dollars can provide. So thank you all for your contributions. And thank you in advance to the next person to contribute, who will do so by either going to paypal.me/NorseCode to make a one-time contribution in any amount, or patreon.com/NorseCode to become a recurring monthly sponsor, which we much prefer. I realized today that I wanted to add another item to my one-item presidential platform.
Okay,
Hashtag
go for it.
Dusty 2020. Before, we talked about this a few weeks ago on the show. I just want a big space laser. I want Elon Musk to make a space laser so we can slice Florida off of America and let it float out into the ocean.
Right.
The only other thing that I would ram through Congress is a law outlawing that ridiculous industrial one-ply toilet paper.
Oh yeah, no, I'm totally behind this.
It is
Dusty 2016, man.
2020.
I'm on board.
I'm not old enough yet.
I'm on board. Whatever.
Yet. And it's too late. Who would nominate me? Even the joke parties have finished their nomination process.
Oh man, you could have a write-in campaign like Joe Exotic.
I'm still not old enough. That's why it's Dusty 2020. Hashtag Dusty 2020.
Well, it doesn't really matter because you're an issue campaign more than you are a presidential campaign. So as long as enough people signal their belief in your principles, which is mainly to get a space laser and get rid of the one-ply industrial toilet paper. Yeah. I think it doesn't really matter if you're actually eligible because you're not going to win. But if you move enough votes, you'll catch everyone's attention. That's the real goal.
That's, I think, one of the finest backhanded compliments anyone's ever given anyone. That's very sweet of you. Do my best. That's very sweet of you. So I suppose we should talk about the Philadelphia incident.
All caps.
Such as it is.
The Philadelphia incident.
Man.
I suppose. There was a game this Sunday here, so I suppose we could talk about that.
Well, and I woke up basically as the game was starting. I was making coffee during the normal part of the first quarter, the first two possessions, and it just seemed like a normal Vikings day. And then, I took my second sip of coffee, and the first turnover. And
it's your fault.
Well, no, no. It was just a lot to process all at once. And as I became caffeinated, the turnover pace just kept accelerating. They just kept getting more and more ridiculous.
Yeah, see, there's a clear correlation between the more caffeinated you were in the morning and how awful the game was.
No, but I'm a time zone behind you, so I was an hour earlier, so it wasn't like.
But the game is shown live. Like, it doesn't.
No, but I was an hour earlier.
Right.
Yeah, so it couldn't have been me affecting the game.
But I mean, the game is still shown live. And you know what? Whatever. Let's talk about the game.
You talk about the game. Like what? So, okay. First question. How bad was the Andrew Sendejo injury? Like really, in terms of the rest of the game? Like how bad a hit was that to the defense?
I think actually probably not that bad. I mean, so Jaron Curse didn't play very well at all. But I think that, Andrew Sendejo's been playing, decently this year. I think that, a lot of people have been talking about, oh my God, he's actually good this year. And I think that's not quite true, but he has been playing at a pretty acceptable level in a defense where if you've only got like 3 people who need to perform at an acceptable level because everyone else, playing at a Pro Bowl level, that's like fine. But Curse, he gave up a couple of plays, and that sucks. And like maybe if those plays hadn't been given up, that'd be better. But really, I don't really think that losing Sendejo was that significant. Losing the pick 6, having him fall just short of the goal line, and then having the Vikings back themselves up with penalties and not be able to punch the ball in, that sucked way more. Because the Vikings would have had a possession and a half lead basically. But no, actually, I think him getting injured in terms of the impact it had on the defense was not that significant. Are you muted?
Oh, of course I am. Why wouldn't I be muted?
Why even take care to ask, Arif?
Okay. 3, 2, 1. Well, yeah, and it seemed to me like this game kind of turned on big moments that just were blundered away. And that's kind of like my thesis for this whole game. This is like one of the most Vikings games that has ever happened. Like all of these errors are the sort of thing that you'd expect to be like sprinkled over like an entire season of Vikings games. And we managed to go 5 games without really very much stuff like that happening. And so every time we were in the red zone, fumble or pick or, random, 4th down stop. we end up in a situation where, we're battling for position on the field. And then what do? They return a kick all the way. And who is our last hope?
Well, a guy whose job really isn't to tackle. Some people are giving Blair Walsh grief. And, yeah, it would have been nice if you could tackle. But, I mean, let's not really... I don't really blame him too much. But, yeah, the guy whose job it is to not do it was the guy whose job it suddenly became. It didn't work.
Made all his extra points, though.
Yeah. I mean, would you say that, on balance, Blair had an all right game? It made a field goal, made an extra point.
Yeah, and it was a decent field goal too, right? It was fine. I mean, what did we really need Blair Walsh injured? That's
right.
Question.
That's definitely part of it. Because clearly the Vikings were not that interested in any free agent kickers because. They're just oh, yeah, I don't think there's anybody we could pick up that'd be better than Walsh. And then the only person they could have possibly picked up, Robbie Gould, has now replaced Shitstain. So no kickers are available. Unless, I guess they could pick up Josh Brown, but, don't.
Scraping the bottom of the barrel, such as it is. So I feel like the game was like I was saying, a collection of incidents that were just very unfavorable to the Vikings, all crammed into one game. And I guess I didn't really see much of that sentiment when I came to the internets after drying the tears and crawling out from under my bed, etc. I felt like Vikings Twitter had more of an issue with kind of the back end of the Vikings operation, like the coaching and the play calling. And I mean, I don't know, maybe you can go into more detail than I can, but it seemed like the run-heavy offense wasn't really working, and we weren't really able to give Sam Bradford time to do anything downfield. Well,
so I think that the play calling exacerbates that that issue that you're bringing up, that there wasn't enough time for Bradford. And I think one of the reasons that there wasn't enough time is because Norv was sort of moving, I think, closer to the offense that he liked to call in 2015. A lot of people say it was a return to the offense, and I think that it felt like that watching it, especially seeing him get hit so often and stuff like that, and seeing like there's some memorable deeper drops. But honestly, it was more splitting the difference between what they did in the first 5 weeks and, what they did in 2015. It wasn't really a return to the offense, but it did result in the Vikings holding on to the ball longer. And it's interesting, right? Because the Vikings were in a situation where they were basically experimenting with what to do at tackle. And when you're experimenting with your tackle position mid-game, maybe not the best time to call like 7-step drops. Like that just seems like the worst possible game plan you could go in with. Hey, here are a couple of players. We have no idea how good they are. Let's put them in the worst possible position. Like for an evaluation, like yeah, I guess from a purely evaluative standpoint, that's ideal, right? You want to put them in the toughest possible situation. From the point of view of wanting to win that game, no, that's terrible. And it was terrible because it's not like you lose that much in terms of evaluation by calling like a tighter, 3-step game or anything like that. So there is a lot to do. There's a lot to say about the play calling. I do think that you're right, though, about one other thing, which is that all of the little things that the Vikings, benefited from in terms of luck over the course of the first 5 weeks, kind of turned against the Vikings in a pretty big way. So, for example, Sam Bradford fumbles a lot. Like he, out of the 40 quarterbacks who've had 400 attempts since he was drafted, he has the 6th most in terms of fumbles per sacks plus runs. Right, every fumble opportunity that he had. So he fumbles a lot, and he hadn't fumbled at all this season. So he fumbles twice. The 2 that were recovered earlier were recovered by the Eagles. The next 2 were recovered by the Vikings. So that kind of evens out, but in terms of the way the game script flowed, it flowed against the Vikings. Marcus Sherrill's, lost a fumble. And then, there was a return touchdown because Charles Johnson was doubled and Justin Tratteau fell. Like those are things that like either, hey, the Vikings were really lucky, kind of, not lucky, but the Vikings were unsustainably good at special teams in terms of being able to prevent returns from doing stuff. Not just preventing returns from scoring touchdowns, but preventing returns from getting like basically any yardage at all. They were unsustainably good there. They were extraordinarily good at that. They were very, very good, unsustainably good at preventing turnovers. They were unsustainably good at creating defensive scores off of turnovers. And all of those things happened. Like, they had an opportunity for a defensive score. It didn't happen. They had an opportunity to stop a punt return touchdown or kick return touchdown. It didn't happen, right? They had an opportunity to like prevent like fumbles or not get fumbled or whatever. It didn't happen. They fumbled the ball 4 times from scrimmage and 1 time in special teams. And Marcus Sherrill's, almost never muffs punts. So for him to, and he didn't, I guess it's technically not a muffed punt because he possessed it and then he lost it. But, he's usually very, very good about ball security. So all of these things kind of flipped in the other direction. And then some things that were unsustainably bad happened too, like the Marcus Sherrill's thing. Sam Bradford, threw a bad interception, probably not the kind of interception that, he would throw in most situations. So those all happened. And the fact that Carson Wentz had a really awful game, it kind of didn't matter because the Vikings kept on putting them in a really good field position and also allowing them to score in situations where Wentz didn't matter, like on a return touchdown and stuff like that. So it feels like the Vikings paid for all of the karma that they had accumulated, basically, paid for all of the small amounts of credit that they earned over the first 5 games with this game. That's what it feels like. Obviously, that's like not a concept I believe in, but like it certainly feels like all of those small things that built up, came home, and then you can talk about like all of this other stuff, like the offensive line play was as bad as we had seen it last year, and it's like down to individual offensive linemen like Jake Long and T.J. Clemmings and Jeremiah Searles, but then also the play calling exacerbated the problems that the offensive line had, and Sam Bradford actually he played worse right than he normally does, even after you account for all of these things. Like a lot of people say, hey, don't blame Bradford because of how often he was pressured. And there's some truth to that. Like I think he looks worse than he played, if that makes any sense. Like, I think that once you correct for the amount of pressure, he looks better than the initial watch would suggest. But he still played poorly. Like, he plays better under pressure. He played better under pressure for the Vikings in previous games this year, where he had a lineman bearing down on him, or there's a threat of a sack, and he did a better job at handling and dealing with those situations in those games than he did in this game. So one can say the pressure exaggerated how poor of a performance Bradford put together, but he still put together a poor performance. It's still a little bit on him too. So there's a lot of problems here. I mean, there's problems with the talent level along the offensive line. There's a lot of problems with the play calling that accelerated that problem. There's problems with how Bradford specifically played. And then there's like all of these other smaller problems that will probably not appear in other games, but are the reason that the Vikings lost. So you can say, I mean, the Vikings lost for reasons that you'd expect, because the offensive line was poor and Bradford came back down to earth and, they didn't recover all those fumbles. And then there are also reasons that are not sustainable that the Vikings lost, like that also contributed in a big way, like a return touchdown and all that. So a lot of things. I'm not going to call it a perfect storm because that's an annoying cliche, and also I guess more things could have gone wrong that didn't. But a lot of things sort of combine together to make for a bad game.
Well, and what's funny to me, one of the many things, I know it's not the same position, but we agonized for so long over the potential new quarterback coming in and being pushed out onto the field without enough experience. How are they going to run the offense? Are we going to Josh Freeman them? Are they going to, go completely off the ranch and we'll never hear from them again? And Jake Long had 1 day in pads and barely even played last year.
Yeah, I don't know. I was surprised that he only had 1 day in pads. I guess that has to do with the way that they practice differently during the bye week or whatever. Plus, the CBA limits the number of days you could have full contact practices. I feel like this is one of the situations where you would, use up some of those days. Yeah, it's. I was a big advocate of Jake Long playing right away. I guess I'm wrong about that, but I guess I also didn't know that he only had 1 day in pads. Yeah, it's weird. I don't know. I feel like the decision making for the staff in general was pretty poor. What's weird though, or what's additionally sort of odd, is that TJ Clemmings actually he played better than Searles or Long did, and he actually had a pretty good game against the run. Still pretty poor against the pass, but better against the pass than Searles or Long. Giving a pressure on something like 11% of his dropbacks, which is bad, but it's not it's not 30%, which is what Jake Long did. Which, I mean, that's just an unbelievable rate of pressure. I don't think that these offensive line problems will continue in the same way that I thought they would. A couple of games ago, I was like, hey, this offensive line is trash. I mean, you've got, Brandon Fusco's playing poorly, and Andre Smith is playing poorly, and TJ Clemmings is playing poorly. This is all bad, and it's going to be bad for the rest of the season. Now, after maybe the worst offensive line performance of the year, I think there's reason for optimism, which is the weird thing. I think that Jake Long is going to get better, with a little bit more time. Maybe play TJ Clemmings for most of the snaps next week, too, just to avoid the problems that having Long in there caused. But I think that TJ Long will get better once he knocks the rust off. I mean, you're right, he didn't play, anything but 11 snaps last year, and then this year he only had 1 practice in pads. Really puts, Bradford at risk. But, as he knocks the rust off, I think that he'll get better. And then, I think the way Jeremiah Searles played in this game was uniquely bad. I don't think he will continue to be that bad because he's been very good for the Vikings at right tackle against some very, very good pass rushers. So I think that he will, play better than he did. And so long as the interior of that offensive line continues to play at the level that they've played for the past 3 weeks, or past 2 weeks plus the bye, Joe Berger, he's not playing as well as he did last year, but he's playing all right. Brandon Fusco, I think he's been underrated by fans. I think that, you see, especially because there's a broadcast replay of Brandon Fusco giving up the tackle for loss, it's very easy to be like, well, he had a bad game. And I think that most of the time when a broadcaster isolates an offensive lineman, they probably had a bad game because you can't have that many mistakes and have it be a good game. But I think that, for the most part, he's actually played pretty well for the last couple of weeks. Alex Boone has kind of turned it around. He also had a couple of really, really bad blocks that showed up, but I think for the most part, he played better than he had in the first couple of weeks. So if you take a look at that interior line, I mean, there's a bunch of players there that are playing basically average or above average football, a little bit closer to above average. And then Searles, who could improve. And then at the left tackle position, if Jake Long, or Searles, who could go back to his mean, as not even improve. And then Jake Long could potentially replace TJ Clemming so long as he knocks the rust off. There's actually a lot more optimism for this offensive line than I thought there was a couple weeks ago.
Well, so to single out Jeremiah Searles some more, do you think against the Eagles he got owned more by scheme or more by his matchup?
I think the matchup plays a really big role. Brandon Graham is an extremely talented pass rusher who this year's finally kind of getting the credit for the kind of talent that he had. The Eagles used him as a rotational pass rusher for far too long. I thought it was actually kind of criminal what they were doing to him, and I was kind of surprised that he re-signed with the Eagles when he hit free agency. He finally, got a starting role, and he did really, really well in that starting role. And I've compared him to Everson Griffin in the past, and, people got kind of upset. They were like, well, he's not nearly as good as Everson Griffin. When it's like, you don't remember how Everson Griffin was perceived when he re-signed with the Vikings. People thought, the Vikings massively overpaid him, that he could potentially be a starting quality defensive end, but he might not be. And at the time, I was ecstatic. I thought he was a really, really good defensive end that could, protect, the defense against runs as well as rush the passer. And he's turned into maybe the last couple of games, we can't say premier 4-3 defensive end, but he's turned into a very good one. And I think Brandon Graham is in sort of the same mold where he's a rotational guy for far too long. And he kind of lost the attention of people who keep track of players. And so, you kind of got lost in the weeds, but he's really, really very good, and I think that was a big part of the reason that Jeremiah Searles struggled. I think it's just Brandon Graham is good. But another part of it is I think that, the way that the Vikings, called plays, made things worse for Searles. I mean, the Vikings did not call that many more 5-step or deeper drops in this game than they have for most of the year. In fact, if you take a look at the 3-step drop or quicker or faster rate this year, they've been, closer to like 40% of their passes being those kind of quick passes or protected passes like on rollouts. Last year, they only had, 8% of their passes were 3-step or 1-step drops, and only 20% of them were protected by things like rollouts. So, going from 20%, which was the third lowest in the league, to 45%, which would be among, sort of the highest in the league, was a really good move for the Vikings. In the first couple of weeks. And this week, they didn't actually stray as far from that as you might have thought. But there was a bunch of little things that added up that forced Bradford to hold on to the ball a little bit longer. First, the stuff that was 5 steps, a lot of that got turned into 7 steps. The stuff that was 5 steps or 3 steps, they added some hitch steps into that. So even though it was technically like a 3-step drop where you could get the ball out of your hand really quickly, they actually forced him to hold on to the ball for a beat or two longer. Because the receivers weren't out of their breaks yet, and they forced some hitch steps into it. So there's like a lot of little things that added time on to the drop back, which exacerbated the scheme. So a lot of things at play. But yeah, I think one of the things that is worth pointing out is like you said, the matchup. That Brandon Graham is just very good.
So I wanted to circle back a little bit. And I guess this kind of dovetails in with the stuff about the uncreative 2015-esque play calling, but like watching the Monday night game, you see Denver running a pretty effective 3 running back and quasi fullback situation, and I get that the Vikings don't have like a Devontae Booker, but it seemed like our kind of 3-headed rushing attack was significantly less effective. I mean, how much of that was on Jerick McKinnon not being as available, and how much of that was just maybe unnecessary reliance on Matt Asiata?
I think that this is actually it's like really difficult to understand it within some contexts, and it's really important to like think about this in terms of the other games. I thought this was a better running performance than the previous games the Vikings have had. In fact, it might have been the best running performance the Vikings have put together, but that doesn't mean it was good. Like, I think you're right that it wasn't necessarily very effective. But I mean, you take a look at, Jerick McKinnon before he got injured, he was averaging, over 4 yards a carry, which is really nice, given sort of, the way the offensive line has been playing. After he got injured the first time, it kind of dipped down a little bit. I think he ended up with 3.9 yards a carry, but his success rate was absurd. It was something like 67% of his runs were successes, and that's phenomenal. That's really good. It's very difficult to get that. Matt Asiata also had a high success rate, but he just wasn't as explosive as McKinnon, or used in situations where it's easier to get yards, where it was more important to get, a third down conversion into a first down. From short yardage, which was not something Matt Asiata had to, not something Jerick McKinnon had to do as often. So his yards per carry was a little bit lower for most of the game. Ended up being higher at the end because of the 3rd and 13 draw. I think the run game was all right. I think that the run blocking up the middle was fine. I think that was maybe the best kind of performance the offensive line put together. Like if you take a look at pass protection from the interior versus the exterior, run blocking from the interior versus the exterior. I thought the run blocking up the middle may have been sort of the best parts of it. I think they were constrained creatively in this game because of the talent level of, the way the offensive tackles were performing. Zach Kieran was the 6th tackle. He did a very, very poor job as the 6th tackle. And he himself gave up at least 1 tackle for loss, and he only had 5-6 snaps. But he also just couldn't maintain lanes, and so they had to squeeze out of his lanes and stuff like that. So I think they were constrained creatively in this game just by the talent level of the people that would allow them to be more creative. They did occasionally expose, running lanes when they shouldn't have and stuff like that. But I think that in this game, I wouldn't criticize the creativity of the running game too much as opposed to in previous games.
Well, so it seemed like both Bradford was getting banged up and we couldn't really establish any sort of run. Do those two things always exist together, or was there maybe a way since the offensive line was turnstiling so badly and Bradford was getting very little time on short drops to get the ball out, is there something that could have been done play calling wise to maybe put more of the load on the running backs, or was that just not something that was going to happen?
Given how quickly the Vikings fell behind, I think it was probably not fated to happen. You take a look back, there's 47 dropbacks, plus I think 3 that were called back because of penalties. So 41 pass attempts, 6 sacks, 3 penalties, or so. And that's a really, really high number. And so you take a look at that, you take a look at the number of running attempts, which wasn't actually very low. It was something like 26 or 7. And you think, well, that's pretty imbalanced, but it really does make sense in the context of the situation they were put into, where they had to pass to catch up. And so, I don't know, I would feel uncomfortable telling North Turner to run the ball more in an effort to be more creative, because that's usually been his problem, right?
It's true. What do you even stand for when you say something like that?
Yeah, right. I would say that their passing plays could have used a little bit more, in terms of yak-friendly routes. And it's not like they didn't throw screens. One of the screens they attempted to throw was almost picked off, and so it wasn't like those are risk-free moves. But I thought, they should have had more. And this is weird because over 50% of Sam Bradford's yardage in this game came from yards after the catch, which is a pretty high rate. But I still think they should have trusted the receivers to break tackles a little bit more than they should have trusted Bradford to beat those defensive backs through the air. That would have been a better and potentially more creative use of what they had. As for the running game, I thought the running game was sufficiently creative. I thought that the Wildcat stuff was good. I thought that Jerick McKinnon himself was able to create some yards out of nothing when stuff wasn't blocked from up ahead and stuff like that. But I don't know, 47 dropback or 49 dropbacks potentially is a lot, but in this game it kind of just makes sense because the Vikings on average were down by 7 points over the course of the game. 7.4 points that's how often they were down. Things would have changed, if they had been able to convert that 4th and 1, or if they'd been able to turn that pick into a pick 6. But I kind of get it. It's a little pass happy for how down they were, but I get it.
Well, and what if the officials don't pick up that pass interference flag that was obviously pass interference? Like,
that was terrible. I don't really like to complain about officials too much, and it's not as if they were such a consistent presence throughout the game that, it's easy to blame them for the game or anything like that, but individually that was a terrible play. Yes. And then also individually, that could have changed the nature of the course of the game. Again, it might not have, so it's not like you could say, the officials were the difference, especially because Bradford was playing poorly before then anyway.
That could have been our first disappointment in the red zone, but it was still an obscenely bad call. Like, picking up a flag, ugh.
But yeah, it's like way different than a non-call. It was, we saw something, and then when we talked about it and thought about it, we decided no. Like, you actively decided that and you took a decision back. You, like, overcame your systemic bias in favor of the decision you already made. Well, in order to take, it's just incredibly bad.
And when half a second of video evidence would have confirmed your initial ruling, like instantly, you're like, oh yeah, he wasn't even looking at the ball. He had his hands all up in Diggs' face mask, like obviously pass interference. And just like, I don't know. To me, that was like kind of the moment that started to let the air out of the tires of the whole game, because that could have been, at least we get 3 points. We don't end up in a ridiculous situation later where, it's 4th and 1 and we don't convert.
Well, you could actually talk about the officiating involved in that 3rd down, 4th down, scenario. So, for example, I thought the officials got the spot wrong on 4th and 1. Not a lot of people agree with me, and that's fine, because it's actually very, very difficult to confirm that, because it was a run up the middle on 4th and 8. It's very difficult to get the spot right. But I thought they got the spot wrong. But beyond that, they also forced the Vikings to hurry when the Vikings shouldn't have been forced to hurry by just standing on the ball and letting the clock run. The clock shouldn't have run.
And Zimmer even tried to. That was the series that Zimmer even tried to call a timeout, and the officials didn't see him. That's the third failure
they had. Zimmer tried to call a timeout, and they didn't see him.
That was garbage.
Yeah, and it's because the new rules prevent coaches from running out into the field even to call a timeout. There's all kinds of problems, right? So
based on the sidelines,
because of those new rules, they should be pretty aware of what the coaches want. So there's a lot of failures there.
A lot of bungled moments in very Vikings fashion.
Yeah. And again, the Vikings got outplayed by the Eagles, so it's not as if, the officials are at fault. But,
barely.
They really screwed up, and that could have changed the game.
The Eagles' special teams outplayed our special teams, surely. And their defense and our defense, toss up. But did their offense really, outplay our offense? Carson Wentz did not a lot.
No, he didn't do a lot. And that makes me so happy. It was the worst game probably of Carson Wentz's nascent NFL career. His passer rating was 25 points below his next lowest passer rating. His QBR is the lowest it's ever been. His adjusted net yards per attempt is the lowest it's been. And he had a very, very poor game. And that's almost entirely because of the secondary. I don't think there was that much pressure on him. I don't think the linebackers did an incredible job, forcing them to abandon the run or anything like that. The Vikings did do a pretty good job against Ryan Matthews and Wendell Smallwood. Ryan Matthews did break out one pretty good run for 20 yards, but for the most part, Matthews was bottled up, Smallwood was bottled up, and then Carson Wentz as a runner was bottled up. And that might have to do with, the Vikings sort of mushing the rush and playing the run in ambiguous run-pass situations from the defensive line. But the secondary just did such a phenomenal job that Carson Wentz just had a really bad game, and he was forced to dump it off. And you remember when I said, the Vikings had, 50% of their yardage come after the catch, which is very, very high. Carson Wentz had something like 80% of his yardage come after the check. He had to check it down so often as a result of what the Vikings were doing in the back that he ended up getting almost all of his yardage coming after the catch, which is the highest of the week, and it would probably be one of the highest marks of the year. So that's pretty incredible. Still, he played pretty poorly, and it's not just because the Vikings defensive backs played so well, although they did. They got 2 interceptions. That Xavier Rhodes one was really cool. But also, I mean, Carson Wentz just made bad decisions. I mean, for example, the Xavier Rhodes interception that I just mentioned was thrown into like triple or quadruple coverage. So
okay, but
he had
that
a really bad game.
But that particular play, that was the classic formation the Vikings have been using, all season. They line up and then two of the defensive backs rotate. One rotates, towards the line, or, Harry Smith speeds up towards the line, and they all kind of change assignments right at the end. And of course, they did that a lot this game, and I think that that look was very effective in confusing the crap out of poor Carson Wentz.
Yeah, no, I think that was a big part of it. Against Washington and Detroit, Carson had some difficulty with coverages that were well disguised, or trap coverages like that, and the Vikings, saw that, they drew it up and they put it in, and that's exactly what happened.
Oh, so there you go. Yeah, I don't know that. I think that's the sum of my gripes. Primarily, the officiating really stuck out in my mind as unfortunate, we'll call it, and I don't know. It was just a crazy game that really exposed the. And okay, final question: do you buy into what is becoming the conventional wisdom on like the national beat that the weakness at the Vikings offensive line is what will keep them out of like a deep playoff run of the Super Bowl?
I mean, I think the weakness on the offensive line is why the Vikings would lose a playoff game and therefore keep them out of the Super Bowl. I don't think it'll keep them out of the playoffs. I mean, I don't know. I feel like the only team without a weakness right now are the Patriots, and it's not as if the Patriots have a bunch of extraordinary strengths. They have one strength. It's Tom Brady, and a bunch of non-weaknesses. The rest of the teams they've all got weaknesses somewhere. That's not to minimize the significance of the weaknesses that the Vikings have on the offensive line. It's probably a bigger weakness than some teams have. Some playoff teams have along whatever weaknesses they have. But one relatively large weakness doesn't disqualify you from the playoffs if you've got a lot of strengths, and the Vikings have a lot of strengths. They've got a very good defensive line. They've got a linebacker core. It's probably underperforming right now, but a very good linebacker core, and they've got a great secondary. They've also got some pretty good receivers. They've got a surprisingly effective quarterback right now. So they've got a lot of things going for them. I don't think that the offensive line weakness is like something that's going to kill them and take them out of like the NFC North lead and stuff like that. I mean, the Vikings have been playing very, very well. They've just had one bad game. But I do think that this is part of the blueprint for how you beat the Vikings. Some of it, like I mentioned at the beginning of the show, is not super sustainable stuff that you can rely on. But some of it is. Like, some of it's just like, yeah, I mean, your offensive line sucks, so we're going to take advantage of it, and that's how we're going to win. And that's how teams sometimes win some football games, and that might happen in the playoffs against a team that has a really good defensive line. So, no, I don't think it disqualifies. I don't think it makes it more likely than not that the Vikings are going to falter early on or early in the playoffs, but I do think it is the biggest concern, and one reason that if I were to pick a reason that the Vikings were going to win the Super Bowl this year, it would be the offensive line. And I mean, also, I mean, they're not favorites, right? It's probably the Patriots that are the favorites. But yeah, it's a concern, but it's not like in this year's NFL that fatal, relatively speaking.
Relatively speaking. Any final thoughts, or should we march on towards the mailbag? We got a handful of questions, although to be fair, a few of them are fairly similar.
Yeah, well, no, let's head to the mailbag.
Alrighty. School88 at schoolpage writes us in all caps. I'm not going to yell into my microphone. That is generally not advisable. But he writes, "Why did we change our offensive game plan?"
So evidently, they changed it a lot less than you would have expected, but it did change. Like I did detail some of that. I think Norv Turner got comfortable, and that's the worst Norv Turner you could possibly ask for.
Is too fancy, Norv Turner?
Yeah, he's like, well, now we can do the stuff I love to do. The stuff you love to do is outdated and bad. Yes, but I love it. Like, that might be it. I don't know. I'm just so stuck on this, and I have no idea if it's true. I've been repeating it on podcasts, in articles, to people I meet and stuff and talk to. And I don't know if it's true, but it just feels so true. The Pro Football Focus podcast, Sam Monson said a couple of weeks ago, I think like the third week of the season, this offense looks so different than last year's offense. And I think it's because Norv Turner was correcting for a mistake in his quarterback, or he wasn't as confident in his quarterback. When he's confident in his quarterback, when he has his Phillip Rivers and his Troy Aikmans, he installs his offense. And that's what happened with Teddy. And then he didn't install his offense. He installed some sort of compensatory offense with Sam Bradford that maybe to him feels cheap and gimmicky. Maybe he's right that it's not sustainable. I have a lot of questions about that. I don't think that's quite the case. But, the more comfortable Sam Bradford's, gotten into the system, the more confidence the coaches can have in him in developing a more complete offense, the more it seems like we go to an offense that is best suited for the mid-90s. So if, his offense changed significantly, and I think that we're a little bit too willing to overstate how much it has changed significantly from the previous 5 weeks. I do think it changed. I don't know how much. I think that might be a reason. And again, I have no reason to believe this. It just sounds so good and so accurate, especially based off of what Norv Turner did in Cleveland, where he designed brilliantly. Like, he designed that offense really well. Now, it wasn't a good offense, but that was more of a talent problem, which is why it was designed so well. That goes back to the thesis. So, it's a difficult question to answer because I don't know, but like the available evidence we have speaks to the most seductive theory I've heard. Is that? I didn't know that. That makes sense.
I mean, he was their head coach, so it wasn't exactly the same like situation or whatever. But he has a lot of experience with the compensatory offense. Why can't he just keep relying on that? It was working so well.
Yeah, some artists are constrained by creativity, man. Norv Turner might be the same, or best when they're constrained creatively, I should say.
Some people should just be painters of light.
Exactly.
Jason Brown at BrownJason with a Y on Twitter. What coverage concepts bothered Bradford the most based on your film review? Assuming you did film, it sounds like you reviewed film.
I did a quick rewatch to get a handle on the offense and to get a handle on the offensive line. I haven't done as much of a rewatch on Bradford versus the Philadelphia Eagles defense, which I know sounds weird because you're just basically just watching the offense. But, I was watching for different things. So I didn't really have as much of a theory as to Bradford's performance. I will say that Jim Schwartz did a bunch of not very Jim Schwartz stuff. And I just got off the phone recording a podcast with Matthew Collar at 1500 ESPN for his analytics department podcast. We talked about this, and I totally forgot that he covered Jim Schwartz and his defenses back in Buffalo. And so I kept on saying all of this stuff about Jim Schwartz defenses because we're familiar with it in the NFC North. And it turns out he was as surprised as I was about the way the Eagles defense operated because Schwartz did a bunch of stuff that he's not used to doing. He did a bunch of safety blitzes. He doesn't do that. Like, he didn't do that in Tennessee. He didn't do that in Detroit. He didn't do that in Buffalo. He did that, this week. He did a bunch of, zone blitzes. I mean, he's never done that. He's not a zone blitz guy. He loves having his front four rush. He loves having them, deploy the wide nine, which is what they did here. And maybe occasionally engage in double three technique looks from the defensive tackles, and just have the front four rush and have like 7 or 8 in coverage. So, it was an unusual situation from a scouting perspective, and maybe Bradford got spooked by that. Maybe if you do stuff that's not put on film, you get spooked by that. Certainly, Bradford seemed to shy away from stuff that was pretty uncharacteristic of what Jim Schwartz does, stuff that he's actually been pretty good at, earlier in the year. So, for example, Bradford reacted too quickly to zone blitzes. He was just much more willing to just dump it off instead of attacking the coverage. Because every coverage you see, hopefully the way that your routes are designed, you've got some answer to it. And, maybe the plays that were called, the routes didn't have an answer to those coverages, but every single time, I don't know. It seemed like he reacted to the stuff that he saw, dumped the ball off instead of attacking the changes in coverage and getting at, whatever new weakness was there that was not there pre-snap. So I think that was more the issue than it was a specific coverage concept that he had trouble with, because the stuff that he was playing poorly against was not necessarily the stuff that he played poorly against throughout, the previous week. So I will say, that's all provisional stuff. I haven't done like a deeper review of either the defense or of Sam Bradford's specific play. I mostly just did the running game and the offensive line in general. But based off of what I saw, it certainly seems like that's the case where it was more just, this is not stuff we expected to see from a Jim Schwartz defense.
All right. Chris Cacciola and Scott Philbin combine, Chris Cacciola on Twitter and at Nickel324 on Twitter combine to ask, what is more worrisome, Norv's play calling or the offensive line play? And do you think Norv adjusts and goes back to a quick pass style of game, or will he be too stubborn and stay fancy?
Norv not known for adjusting all that often, but he did adjust at the end of 2014 for a quicker style of play. He did adjust at the end of 2015 for a quicker style of play. So there is hope that he could adjust back to what was working before for that quicker style of play, and I think that he probably will. I think that this is an example where the coach needs to do something to accommodate a problem, which means that the coach not doing it is a problem, but it is not the problem. So in this case, I would say the offensive line is the bigger problem, but Norv is not responding to that problem appropriately, and it's compounding the issue. So, which is worse? The offensive line problem is the worst because it constrains you, and that might be a good thing in Norv's case, but I think that because he hasn't responded to offensive line constraints, only quarterback constraints, it's probably not in this case. But it prevents you from doing a variety of things. Maybe the stuff that Norv specifically wants to do isn't necessarily great, but there's a wide variety of things you can do if you have a good offensive line. If you got a bad offensive line, there's very little that you can do and you become predictable, and that's exactly what happened to the Giants, who had a poor offensive line that was not giving up much pressure because they had moved to a quick passing game and they had a very uncreative solution to the problem, and they ended up playing poorly as a result. The Eagles did this too. They had a very, very short passing game to counteract this problem, and they ended up playing poorly. So Norv, I think, is responding to it incorrectly, but the best responses will still cause potential problems. So I think the bigger problem is the offensive line.
Well then, Christian Cooper at Surly Cooper on Twitter writes, in all seriousness, are the Vikings just screwed against a good defensive front, or defense in total?
No. It's just such a good team that I don't think there's any situation where they're just screwed from the outset. I think that this is another team. Fans have been used to this for ages now, going all the way back to 2011. But, this is another team that needs to get a lead early and sit on it or whatever. But, this is also a team that is better about being able to score points when down than previous iterations of like the get a lead and sit on a team that the Vikings have had. So I don't think they're screwed. I think that they're in a bad spot, and that this is the kind of Achilles heel that will be the reason that they lose if they do lose in the playoffs. But is not, it's not obvious. The Tennessee Titans have an underrated but very, very, very good defensive line, and the Vikings weren't screwed. The offense played poorly, but they weren't screwed, right? The Vikings have played, some pretty good defensive lines. I guess the Carolina one is not as good as people thought it was, but the Houston Texans, Jadeveon Clowney, Whitney Merciless, they did a really, really good job, and the Vikings weren't screwed. In fact, they rolled. So I don't think they're screwed, but I think that that's the weakness. Like that's the strength versus weakness matchup you want to avoid.
All right. Kyle Stroud at KStroud87, and I guess to a lesser extent, Emil Ramsvik at ES Ramsvik on Twitter, and Christian Cooper again write in, what chance do you believe the Vikings have of getting anyone else to play left tackle? And Christian and Emil suggest can either you or I play tackle?
Well, I think that me playing tackle would probably be a poor idea.
Categorically, no.
Can't speak for you.
Hard no.
Okay.
I am 6 foot and 185 pounds, and not like, I mean, I occasionally smoke cigarettes. No, absolutely not.
I was going to say no to the idea that there are potential other tackles, but the 49ers are shopping Joe Staley. The Browns are potentially shopping Joe Thomas. Officially, they say they are not. Unofficially, people with sources, multiple reporters with multiple sources are saying that they are, so they probably are. The biggest problem, of course, is that the Vikings have no money. Like from a cash flow perspective, I'm sure Ziggy Wolf is doing fine, but from a salary cap perspective, there's like no more room at the table. There's $590,000 of cap room at the lowest in the NFL. Andy Carlson suggested something that, frankly, I thought was kind of genius in terms of its out of the box thinking, which was to trade Adrian Peterson. Because the argument is he's not going to play this year, which I know Chris Thomason reported that Adrian Peterson was seen without a wrap, but that's actually pretty irrelevant to his recovery because it wasn't a stabilization thing. I mean, like, your recovery is going to progress like that. But he's not going to play this year. The Vikings shouldn't play him next year or pay him next year. They should cut him next year.
They should trade him to the Browns.
Yes, they trade him to the Browns. The Browns have the most cap space in the league. They can just absorb it, and then you'll be fine. I don't know the logistics of it. I don't think you can trade players on IR, and you cannot take Adrian Peterson off of IR quickly enough to trade him before the November 1st deadline, if that's the case. But it was a genius idea.
I hope they do it anyway. I hope they do it before next season starts. That would be a win for all parties, I think. Mostly the Vikings.
I mean, the point is just to trade cap space. I don't think the Browns are going to use Adrian. Like, it's just you trade. So it's just like in the NBA where you can trade cap space. Sort of. I mean, I guess I don't know the NBA that well, but you could like trade amnesty clauses and stuff like that. So you trade extra cap space, and then you trade what you normally would trade for Joe Thomas. And then you go extra room. Again, I think from a CBA perspective, that's probably not going to work. But I thought it was like a brilliant way of thinking.
If only it could be that simple.
Yeah, I don't really envision another scenario. Like, I don't like you could, if you traded Captain Munnerlyn to the Browns and a pick, like a mid-round pick, like a 4th or a 5th, and got Joe Thomas, I could see that. You'd have to have a lot of faith in Mackenzie Alexander. You would have to deplete, for the first time ever that the Vikings have had quarterback depth, you'd have to get rid of it right away. But you get Joe Thomas. I just don't know, like, if you're in win now mode, if you're trading for veterans mid-season in order to boost your odds of doing well, I don't know if trading one of your like low-key best performers is really smart, because I don't think Mackenzie Alexander is going to play as well as Captain Munnerlyn has. So I don't think that's a smart, but that would free up cap room, and it would massively improve the left tackle situation. And maybe that improvement at left tackle is worth more than the decline at nickel corner. But yeah, I don't know. Like, that's a good idea. Eric Galco at Optimum Scouting was the one that pitched that idea to me. That one makes more sense. He also pitched the Mackenzie Alexander trade instead of the Captain Munnerlyn trade, but I don't think that's going to work because you don't free that much cap room that way. Yeah, I don't think there's really a possibility to trade for an offensive tackle, but I didn't think there was an opportunity for them to sign Jake Long, and they just restructured Mike Harris's contract to do that. You can't restructure players on IR, but Mike Harris is NFI, so he was fair game, actually. I don't really know what to do beyond that. Like, you can't just cut a player on IR because their injury settlement's going to cost the exact same, and so you'll be on the books for that anyway. And I don't really know how else you could restructure some of the players you just re-signed, but I don't think that it'd be easy to restructure Harrison Smith after he just signed with the Vikings. I don't think it'd be easy to restructure Alex Boone. I don't think it'd be easy to restructure Kyle Rudolph in the only season he's actually playing well in. But those are really your options.
Well, yeah, and there's no sense throwing a gold anchor overboard if the ship isn't like imminently sinking.
Right. I mean, the team might be doing well enough that you don't need to make that kind of move. That's a good point.
Well, exactly. I guess speaking of players on IR, Skull, and that's Skull Vikings, not Skull Tobacco, at KDurantula3553 on Twitter, writes, your thoughts on the latest Teddy Bridgewater reports?
Nothing. They mean nothing. For people who haven't heard or seen it, Adam Schefter reported that there is a concern that Teddy Bridgewater may never play again. But it should be noted that that is not a team doctor, which I'm pretty confident Schefter would have made clear, who said that, but it is like a doctor, like someone who's familiar with the concept of knee dislocations.
Very general terms, right? Like,
yeah,
like someone with this injury could,
yeah,
no,
this is the kind of injury that could end a career, which is like, yeah, we knew that like from day one. I don't know, why are you reporting this now? No, there's nothing new about it. If Teddy Bridgewater never plays again, that doesn't validate the report. It just validates all of the stuff we heard literally the day that it happened.
Well, I'll tell you what, it doesn't mean nothing. It means everything to media companies. Precious, precious clicks. Teddy Bridgewater may never play again, click. And they're like, oh, this is garbage. And then you click away, but it's too late. You already clicked. And
but the bounce rate's high.
That's, well, not high enough to prevent the existence of total clickbait nonsense like this.
That's true. I mean, also, companies that sell ads don't do a very good job of calibrating to... Anyway, it doesn't matter.
I mean, you would if you ran an ad company, apparently. It's the impression I'm getting. I won't talk impressions.
That was bad.
This is I know I was going to go right into the name, but this one's a stumper. It's Polish, I think. Patty Pryorowski? Yeah, Patty Pryorowski at P. Pryorowski on Twitter. Wow, that was a mouthful. Oh, God, and the question's no better. Can you explain offensive line rotation rationality to me?
Nope.
Literally have no idea why, with some question marks. Neither do we.
Yeah, so actually, Pete Carroll and Bill Belichick have both tried this, and if you're like, hey, both Pete Carroll and Bill Belichick think this is interesting, like, it's not on face bad then, right? Like, you're just like, oh, two the best coaches in the NFL want to figure this out? Okay.
It's not on face good either, and it doesn't necessarily mean that their other ideas are good. Maybe they both like Twix bars.
Right. They also both abandoned it. Like, so.
Well, that doesn't mean it's necessarily bad. Well, actually, no, it probably does.
So, it's worth like thinking about for half a second, but it's just not. I mean, they rotated them in part to evaluate Jake Long, but it exacerbated some of the problems that they had. So there's the rationale is we wanted to see Jake Long, and the second sub rationale, which I actually kind of hated, was that if Jake Long is going to play, then TJ Clemmings is going to play right tackle, not Jeremiah Searles. I think that's not smart, but that was like part of the thought process. So that's why Clemmings rotated from left to right, and that's why you had like platoons of tackles.
Do you think maybe the this like notion that you should just always draft left tackles for every position in the NFL has anything to do with it?
Not. I mean, maybe there are definitely general managers who believe this, so maybe.
Oh, that's something. Brian James writes in with an email question, which you can submit by emailing us at norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. How far back in time can you go and still find a team that could compete for the Super Bowl in 2016? And how far back do you have to go to find a Super Bowl winner that would lose to the 2016 Browns? Well, probably, wow.
I love this question. This is fascinating.
Ooh, okay.
So, like, for example, could the, 1998 Broncos beat the 2016 Browns? Probably, right? Could the 1984 was it the 49ers? They won one of those years. They won many of those years. So could the mid-'80s 49ers
the Joe Montana 49ers?
Yeah. Could they beat the 2016 Browns? That, I think, is a much more interesting question than I think people would initially give it credit for. Like, I think a lot of people would be like, wait, Joe Montana and? That San Francisco defense was underrated, too. Like, it was the number 1, 2, or 3 defense in the league in a lot of those years, plus the number 1 offense, right? You're like, well, obviously they beat the 2016 Browns. I don't know, actually. I certainly think that the 77-78 teams would not, by any reasonable stretch of the imagination, get close to beating the 2016 Browns. Well, that's only like 6 years removed from that. I think that the cutoff point is somewhere around 90, 91, 92.
Like with kind of the birth of the West Coast offense?
Well, kind of. Like the evolution of the West Coast offense into the spread offense. I think that's a big part. Assuming we're playing with 2016 rules and that their defensive backs could adapt to those rules.
Yeah, and assuming that coaches would coach the same way with 2016 rules.
Right. And, those are all like pretty heavy assumptions. But I think that, you take a team that's like used to, early 90s football and you play them against athletically superior pass rushers that the Browns have. You play them against athletically superior cornerbacks that the Browns kind of have, in an offensive philosophy that is difficult to defend against, and much more mature in terms of its offensive design. Like, yeah, you had people who ran the ball well from the quarterback position, but to make that part of the offense, like in a way that doesn't resemble like the option offenses of the 60s in college, like Oklahoma and the wishbone, but rather like the spread option offenses that are much more difficult to defend right now. I think that's where you get where most mid-90s teams would not be able to beat the 2016 Browns, because I think that the differences in athleticism and the evolution of these concepts to deal with what people have done. And, we're making fun of Norv Turner for running a 1996 offense. One of the reasons that's bad is because it really puts way too much stress on that offensive line, and the 7-step drops turn into sacks. Plus, here's another thing to keep into account. It wasn't until very recently that we started caring about running back fumbles. Running backs used to fumble all the time, and now turnover ratio matters. And so I think that you're less likely to turn the ball over than some of those really good 90s teams. So that's that answer. And then the flip side of that was, so I answered the second question first, right?
Yep. Now, how far back in time can you go and still find a team that could compete for the Super Bowl in 2016? I would have to say, because when you talk about going back to find a good team that would lose to the Browns, you're talking about teams from basically like 2 schematic eras ago. And I don't think you could really go back much further than 1. I think you'd have to go back to maybe like the 2001 Rams or something, or the 2000 Rams. Like, I think you have to go back maybe 1 like play calling era in order to find a team that would be competitive this year.
Yeah, I think, the 99 or 2001 Rams would be kind of where you are, and that's it. I don't know that. Yeah, because I don't think the 96 or 97 Packers could do it. I think that's about right. 2001, 2002, like the Baltimore Ravens, and the 2000 Baltimore Ravens, 2002 Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The thing is, the Buccaneers would get demolished. Because the Tampa 2 is like exposed.
Well, but that's exposed. Like an odd like anomaly, is that that became such like a hot trend, and then everybody started like scheming for it, and now it's kind of like randomly old and busted, where there's still all these other concepts from that era that remain relatively untouched, maybe for good reason.
Yeah, right. So I'm guessing the 2000 Ravens defensive setup would do better. Now that the more I think about it, the Mike Martz Rams setup might actually do just as bad because it relied on 5-man pass protection and 7-step drops, and like if you, as a Vikings fan, that just makes you shudder. But
that's 5 people you won't even see on your TV screen.
Really good.
Well, when you have a line that good, you can afford 5-man pass protection.
Yeah, and they had a modern running back and.
One of the first modern running backs who probably would not have as great of a career if he was starting today, but you know.
But he'd certainly be more than effective. Like he wouldn't. He'd
be Todd Gurley.
Be healthy Jamal Charles or an unsuspended Le'Veon Bell, but he'd be
Todd Gurley.
Well, I hope he'd be better than this year's Todd Gurley.
Oh, well, I mean, yes. Okay, he'd be 2015 Todd Gurley.
There you go. So they had a modern running back who would be good. They had just astoundingly good offensive linemen, and I think those offensive linemen would translate. I don't have any question about that in my head. I think the way Kurt Warner plays translates. I think that the play calling doesn't, but I think they'll just get over that. And then they're very comfortable with 3 receiver sets. They might actually have the tight end pass block a lot. Like that's the one weird thing about the Martz offenses is that their tight end might be able to pass block a lot. So you end up with a different kind of 6-person protection. So I would go the 99-2001 Rams would do well. The 2002 Buccaneers would not. The 2003 Patriots actually probably wouldn't, but the 2006-07 Patriots would. It's so weird.
Okay, so Patriots versus Patriots. Between 03, 06, and 07, who has the best chance against 2016 Patriots? Like Brady
07.
versus Brady. 07?
Yeah. The 07 Patriots are the most modern, the latest most modern Super Bowl appearances. I mean, they didn't win, but yeah.
So that's got to be like our ultimate backstop for Super Bowl competitive in 2016. Is the 2007 Patriots, and then maybe
that's definitive, and then I think we can reasonably speculate all the way back to 2001.
You can bookend that with like the 2001 Rams.
Yeah, whew. We're either really pessimistic about old players or stuff changes fast.
Stuff changes fast, and the rate of change increases too.
That's true too.
Like, why do you think like the average age of an NFL player is like? I would watch the hell
out of those 70s teams though. The 70s Cowboys against the 2016 Browns. I would enjoy watching that so much.
I would like to watch the 98 Vikings compete against maybe like the bottom 2/3 of the league this year.
Well, so I held back on talking about the 98 Vikings in this particular segment because they were also pretty modern relatively. Like they were very 99 Rams-ish in terms of how they set up their offense. So that would be, and they had a really good offensive line that I think could be good now. But I didn't want to like have my perceptions colored, so I didn't talk about them that much. I think they would do well. I think a lot of good teams would not, but the 98 Vikings, the bones of them were like good enough that, and not even good enough. Good enough's not the right word. Modern-ish enough that it may not have mattered.
Well, and they're like the ultimate execution of like the Green Bay or the New Orleans style, team where you just put up 48 points and let the other team, do whatever it can, and it probably won't be enough.
Right, exactly. This was fun. I like this. I like acknowledging that like other teams would be trash right now. Just let's dispense with nostalgia for a second and talk about how bad everybody was historically speaking.
Right. Speaking of bad, you're just setting that for like perfect one-word segues. Ted Harwood at Theodore Harwood on Twitter writes us, "Do you feel like the NFL product is significantly worse this season, as many people are saying?" Who are many people?
A lot of people. A ton of people are saying it, actually.
Oh, really? I thought it. See, that initially struck me because I've seen like a couple of articles, and I immediately they show up in my Google Now feed or whatever, which is, SEO goes into that, and I filed them in the same folder as the stuff about Teddy Bridgewater. This is clickbait. It's not. Oh my God, football's getting worse. I should probably look at no, come on, it's not getting worse, right? Or is it?
I don't think football is getting worse. I think that primetime games happen to be worse.
So
does that make sense? I think there's a bunch of bad matchups, and I think that those bad matchups are supplemented with bad officiating, and I don't think that's the norm. I think that there's a bunch of 1 o'clock games and some 4 o'clock games that are really good that got buried. That would be nice to have in prime time. And you couple this with all of this, the ratings are down stuff, which I genuinely believe. I don't think that the debates have much of an impact because they've been down on non-debate nights. They've been down during primetime games where there's been nothing to compete with them. I don't know how many people are streaming. I don't know how many people are watching in bars. I feel like people are actually not watching in bars as often as people are saying they are, so I think that doesn't account for the ratings difference. But, if you're watching Thursday Night Football on Twitter.com, that's not in the Nielsen ratings right now.
But
they just installed a thing to account.
They didn't just install it. They announced that they were going to.
Yeah.
And not only can you stream games on Twitter, but you can stream any primetime game that's on NBC on the genuinely terrible NBC Sports app. If you can handle,
stop. That sucks. I hate it.
If you can handle listening to the same 3 commercials every commercial break, and there are 30 commercial breaks in an NFL game?
Right.
But, and of course, there might be ways around that. I wouldn't know any of them. But, you can watch NBC NFL games on their free app. You can watch ESPN games with their app that you have to have a cable subscription to log into. So, and this is all relatively new in the last couple of years, and they're starting to do some Thursday night games free. You can start watching them on Twitter. So if the move to streaming is succeeding and the move to having football viewing parties is succeeding, then shouldn't the ratings, as Nielsen defines them today, shouldn't they be going down?
Right. Yeah. You're right, and they absolutely should be. I think the argument that the primetime product is bad is still relevant, though.
Well, that's just because the games have all been terrible. Can you imagine trying to be an NFL fan in London? You have to see the Jaguars literally every time.
Yeah,
it's unfortunate, and I don't know. So what's the solution? Is there should they arrange the schedule differently so that it's always the Patriots versus somebody on a Monday night?
I think that there's a greater degree of predictability on what constitutes a good primetime product than the NFL is, implementing. I understand why you'd think that the Green Bay Packers Chicago Bears game would be interesting because they've got all this storied rivalry. It's the oldest rivalry in the NFL. But the Bears are bad, so the game is going to be bad. Either the Packers are good and it's going to be a blowout and it's boring, or the Packers are going to be bad, which at the beginning of the season seemed unlikely, and it's going to suck even more.
But when they made the schedule, they couldn't predict that the Bears would be this bad. Could they?
They could predict that the Bears would be bad.
That's fair.
If you constructed your schedule based off of Pythagorean wins, and put a lot of the good primetime games in situations where teams with high Pythagorean wins would be, you'd end up with a bunch of good games, and you could install some wiggle room, right, for personalities. You couldn't predict that the Panthers would be bad, but I'm going to watch Panthers games in primetime because it's kind of interesting. Cam Newton is so fascinating to watch.
Okay, but would you watch any other AFC South matchup in primetime?
It's my job. I would, but no, I think that
as a casual fan.
Yeah, I think as a casual fan, no, I wouldn't. Screw that.
Well, exactly. I don't want to watch a AFC North matchup or a random NFC North matchup in primetime unless it's the Vikings, I say, before a Vikings Monday night game.
Right. I could see the arguments for the Pittsburgh Ravens AFC North primetime games, right? But Any game with the Browns, just like wait until they become good because they're not inherently interesting. The Seahawks kind of inherently interesting. You have to take into account the fact that their games end up looking pretty boring sometimes to a lot of people.
They've had 2 games where they finished with 6 points this year, and one of them was a tie.
Right. I'm saying if you used a Pythagorean wins algorithm, you'd end up with a couple of Seahawks games, and that's okay.
Can you imagine if that tie game was the Monday night game?
Oh, my God. Yeah.
Well, and I think at the end of the day, the NFL is kind of putting more and more chips in the red zone channel type basket. Like I think the league is fine having like 11 games at 1 p.m. and then 4 games at 3 p.m. and then 3 more games throughout the rest of the week, because you get like every football person's eyes. You know, if you have the money for red zone, you've got it, or you know someone that has it and you're watching it, and it's just like everybody, they want everybody consuming football crack rather than football, brown frown, I guess. That's kind of mixing metaphors, but...
Do you think that might have played a role in lower primetime viewership, if there is in fact lower primetime viewership? Like, I'm used to watching Red Zone. It's fantastic. It's exciting. Now I have to watch like a game. I don't have time for this.
1 game, and they spend most of the time not scoring. Like, I don't know. It's frustrating when there are multiple games on, and games happen between the 30s, and you really miss like 90% of it. Like, say, Seattle games or St. Louis games, or excuse me, LA games.
Right.
Good. I
yeah.
did
So
it too.
Do you think that like getting people to watch Red Zone, which is a good product, do you think that killed enthusiasm for the full primetime games?
I don't think it kills enthusiasm, and I'm not convinced that it matters, because I think the ultimate benefit to the league for red zone style viewing is that you got to pay a lot of money to DirecTV or directly basically to the NFL to be able to watch TV that way, or to be able to watch games that way, rather, not just any TV. And it's way better for the league to just take that money directly from you than it is to deal with advertisers and like the FCC and all these idiots and all the time and money that it takes. Like, they just want to cut out all the intermediaries and just take a few $100 like right out of your wallet, which, great for them, and actually, kind of great for us, as long as, there are ways for the service to kind of trickle down, because it is like pretty expensive. But like, I don't think the league necessarily cares.
That's a good point. All right, those are our thoughts.
So yes, I guess the NFL product could be worse, but in metagame ways, it's getting better. That's... I don't know. The red zone's pretty great, though. Like, it's hard to not like football when it's just constantly like exciting, or Seattle field goals. And Andrew Siciliano is just the best. Like, that is a man who truly loves his life. Aside from having to live in LA or near LA, like, he has the best job in the world.
Yes.
He even went to work sick last Sunday. He was so sick on the air. Official Norse Code question asker Tommy Gunn at TommyTheGun13 writes in, how do you recommend eating crow? See, I smack talked a lot going into this game.
Graciously, I guess. I don't know. I'm wrong a lot, so I just kind of move forward. I don't know. People like will confuse admitting your mistakes with being humble. But anyone who follows Benjamin Albright on Twitter knows that that's not the case. But yeah, you just admit your mistake, they'll assume you're being humble, and you can go back to being the arrogant dickbag that you are.
He's like...
That's what I do.
Yeah, exactly. You're just gaslighting everyone in the world.
Yeah, I love it.
My answer is turduckrow.
Yeah, that sounds good.
That's how you should eat crow.
I don't know, like cooking time. Anyway.
Actually, no, I would go with turchick crow, because like turducken is kind of a crime against food. Because the best part of a duck is the crispy skin, and like in turducken, it's not crispy. It's like
But I mean, you get the duck
turkey.
fat basting the chicken. I mean, that's great. I want the duck fat basting the crow more than I want the chicken to be there. I'm gonna go with the turducken.
Ooh, or maybe
Even though
maybe
you're
just duck row.
sacrificing, like it's not like you get crispy chicken skin if you make turchick crow, right? You don't have duck. Or you could have duck, just a slightly less optimal duck, and duck is clearly the superior of the four birds. So you just put that in there, let the duck fat baste the crow. You're fine.
Actually, I revise my answer. Duck row. Stuff the crow inside a duck.
Done.
And
Perfect.
roast it. Judd Zolgad's hoodie at JZ Hoodie on Twitter writes in, "What would be your absolute perfect Halloween costume this year?"
I don't really do Halloween anymore. I wish I could. I can't. I wish I had thought of this because I'm sure there's like a bunch of really clever answers and I can't think of one. Oh, probably like Blair Walsh field goal post where the left side has a little extra divot to accommodate the wide left.
Or maybe like a Blair Walsh field goal post with like a football on a spring, and you can like try to get it into the uprights, but it'll never really go.
Both of those are great ideas.
No, I actually have the perfect Halloween costume for this year.
Okay.
Zombie Prince.
Oh, that's great, actually. That's really good. Yeah, I approve. Wait, how about zombie Dave Chappelle Prince?
How would you know he was? Well, never mind. Actually, well, no, my first idea was, and this is like way too elaborate. You'd have to be like, so I've been watching a lot of Skin Wars, which is this like ridiculous, like body painting show in the style of a cooking competition.
Oh, yeah, they just put it on Netflix. We watched a little bit of it and then stopped because what the hell?
I suggest making it like if you can stomach the ridiculousness,